Today we'll be going over Chapter 1.7, Organizational Planning Tools. Organizational planning tools are various methods used by businesses to aid decision making, and the primary ones we'll be focusing on includes the fishbone diagram, the decision tree, the force field analysis, and lastly, the Gantt chart. We'll begin by going over the fishbone diagram. And a fishbone diagram is a graphical representation of the most likely causes and effects of an important business decision. This is an example of a fishbone diagram, and on the left-hand side, we see the root causes of a problem or issue, and on the right, the effect. And all of these causes ultimately contribute to this effect happening. So, how can a fishbone diagram be constructed? Before constructing a fishbone diagram, we must first identify and clearly state the problem or issue. Then we must state the causes of the issue in a precise and concise way, focusing on the causes rather than the symptoms. Next, we may choose to combine individual causes into a bone, which is a subcategory for the issue happening. And then we will circle the root causes that warrants further discussion, and lastly, discuss how each circled cause affects the problem or issue. When we take a look at this example here, we can see that the effect is a demotivated staff or demotivated workforce. And on the left, we can see the causes of this effect, and they're broken down into 4 different bones, 4 different subcategories. The first one being policies, the second one equipment, the second one being people, the third one being equipment, and lastly, the fourth one being procedures. And under each bone, under each subcategory, we can see that there are specific causes that contribute to a demotivated staff. So for example, when we look at this bone here, for people, we can see that there's a lack of ambition and a lack of training, and these are both causes for the ultimate effect of a demotivated staff. And a fishbone diagram is a rather simple graphical representation of the causes and effect of an issue or a problem, and this is typically used by managers to examine how the problem can be fixed and which category or subcategory they must address to fix this issue. The next organizational planning tool we'll be looking at is the decision tree. And firstly, a decision tree is a quantitative decision-making tool that illustrates all options available to a business and their probable outcomes. So this tool is used as a quantitative tool, and it allows managers to calculate the expected value of each decision in order to plan the best option to follow. So when we look at this example here, we can see that this is what a decision tree looks like. And in this decision tree, you might see different things, including a square or circle, different nodes, and also different values, which we'll be explaining. So firstly, we have decision nodes, and decision nodes are shown as squares and used when there's a decision to be made. So in this example, we can see that this A here is a decision node because they can either sell the property this year or sell the property next year. And so this is when a decision has to be made. And we also have circles, which are known as chance nodes. And these are used to show the different possible outcomes of a decision. And for example, when we look at the chance node in this diagram, B, we can see that there are 3 possible outcomes arising from if the business chooses to sell the property next year. The property prices might rise, the property prices might remain unchanged, or the prices might fall. And all of these, they have a probability being 0.7, 0.2, and 0.1. And again, all of these probabilities add up to 1. And so all of these are known as chance nodes. And the actual values of each outcome are stated at the end of each branch. So when we take a look at this diagram again, when the company chooses to sell the property this year, they'll earn $492,000. But if they choose to sell the property next year, they will earn $521,400. and this is calculated by multiplying the amount they earn in each outcome and the probability of the outcome happening. So for example, the probability of property prices rising is 0.7, and if property prices rise, they're expected to earn 540,000. And by multiplying 540,000 with 0.7, they're expected to earn 378,000 if property prices rise. And by adding up the outcomes of each chance, we'll get the final value if the company chooses to sell the property next year. And in the end, after we calculate the different outcomes of each branch, we'll then use two parallel lines to indicate the decision that will be rejected. So in this case, the company chooses to reject selling the property this year because 492,000 that they'll earn is less than 521,000 that they'll earn if they choose to sell the property next year. So the advantages and disadvantages of a decision tree are put here, but essentially a decision tree allows managers to consider different options and the potential outcomes and the likelihood of each outcome. And this allows them to make the best decision and to come up with but also to consider the risk involved in each decision. However, the disadvantages is that the probabilities given in a decision tree are only estimates and are subject to forecasting errors. And so the decision tree might not be the most accurate form of organizational planning, but it is quite a simple and graphical representation of different probability and outcomes. The next organizational planning tool we'll be looking at is a force field analysis. So a force field analysis is used to examine the driving and restraining force for and against change, with the relative strength of each force determining whether the change should take place. So when we look at this diagram here, we can see that the change that the company is aiming to achieve is to introduce new technology or automation. And on the left, we have the driving forces, and on the right, we have the restraining forces. So how is the force field analysis constructed? We first list the driving forces for change and the restraining forces against change, and then we allocate a weight to each of these forces. For example, 1 being a weak force, a 5 being a strong force. And then we draw a force field analysis diagram, including the weights of each driving and restraining force. Then we total the scores of the driving force and restraining force, and then we use the total score to determine if the change should be taken. So again, when we take a look at this example, the driving forces for introducing new technology includes reduced staffing, increased competitiveness, and increased output. And all of these are given a weight, 3, 4, and 3 respectively. And then when we look at the restraining forces, we can see that there are equipment cost, staff training cost, staff redundancies, and lastly, technical breakdowns. And again, all of these forces against change are given a weight out of 5. And when we total up these weights, we can see that the driving forces for change total up to 10, whereas the weight for the forces against change, it totals up to 11. And so we might conclude that there are more forces against change than there are forces for change, and thus the company might choose not to introduce new technology into the business. The main weaknesses, however, of a force field analysis is that the weights attached to each driving and restraining force are subjective and not based on facts or evidence. So again, when we look at this diagram, how can we tell that equipment costs are a bigger force against change than staff training costs? And how can we tell that reduced staffing is a less important force compared to increased competitiveness? So again, force field analysis, the weights assigned to each force are only based on estimates and predictions and are subjective to change. The last organizational planning tool we'll be looking at is a Gantt chart. So a Gantt chart is a visual representation of all tasks in a particular project plotted against the timescale. It is used to plan and schedule business projects, allowing business managers to monitor progress. So this is an example of a Gantt chart, and the project the company wishes to achieve is to have a end of year office party. And here are the rules for constructing and interpreting a Gantt chart. So firstly, a Gantt chart is presented as a bar chart showing all scheduled tasks over a given timescale. And the timescale is shown on the horizontal axis. And in this example, we can see that it ranges from the first day to day 19. And each horizontal bar shows the start and finish dates. So for example, A, it will show that it starts on the first day and ends on the 7th day, whereas task B, it starts on the 8th and ends on the 9th day. But it also shows critical and non-critical activities, and also the relationships between predecessors and successors. So how is a Gantt chart constructed? Firstly, a company has to identify all the activities required for the completion of a project. They must then break down the project into separate and clearly identifiable tasks. Next, they must determine how long each task will take and to identify all dependencies, whether or not tasks can be started until another task is finished or not. And next, they have to determine which tasks can take place concurrently, meaning at the same time. And lastly, they place all tasks in the right sequence on the Gantt chart. So when we look at this example here, we can see that in order for task B to start, task A must be finished, because only after day 7, when task A is completed, can task B be started. However, when we look at tasks C and D, we can see that they're concurrent because they both start on day 10 and they end on different dates and are unaffected by each other. And this is the rule of dependency and concurrent, where for dependencies, there are certain tasks that must be completed before another task can begin, whereas concurrent tasks, they can be started at the same time. And that will be all for chapter 1.7.